Hi everyone, welcome to session 4. I hope you made it through session 3 okay. I do realize that it was a bit long. So my intention is for this session 4 to be shorter and hopefully to make up for some of that extra time that you spent learning last week. And with that, we can go ahead and jump right in. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. I hope you all are doing well over there where you are. Okay. Come on. Okay, finally. So we are on session 4, and this is all about selecting methods for your data collection process. So last week we went over the entire research design process, and I think in that session we also touched on maybe some things to consider as you select your methods, and then during this course we'll go into just a bit more detail on those topics. And of course, remember that we will have our live chat on Facebook on Thursday. So as we go through this presentation, please take notes, write down your questions or your thoughts, and those can all go into the chat, whether that's on Thursday or any other day. Anytime you want, you can add comments there. So today, we'll review some of those main types of research questions that Dr. James mentioned earlier on in the course, and then review some of the different methods and strategies for actually collecting data. And then we'll go through some of the basic steps and questions that you want to ask yourself when trying to select the best methods for your research question. Now, if you think back to session 3, the phases of the research design, you can see here where we're fitting into that process. And of course, your research method, as we know, is largely determined by the purpose of your study, what type of question you're asking, what you're studying, and then of course the method that you select is going to measure or going to influence these other phases like your measurement techniques and your sampling method. So it all fits together, and we're just going to focus on this method selection for now. So we're familiar with these two basic types of data. There's qualitative and quantitative, where quantitative measures relationships among variables or just data in general based on numerical values. And then qualitative uses verbal or nonverbal data to represent the meaning of responses or the meaning of behaviors or situations. You might also hear these described as closed-ended questions for quantitative methods or open-ended questions for qualitative methods. And this is just a really simple comment to remember the difference between those two. And you remember that your question will help guide your methods, right? And so here we have 3 of the types of questions that Dr. James introduced earlier in this course. So we have descriptive, associative, and causal questions. So descriptive, of course, is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially asking what's going on here, and it's going to collect data about a certain event or a certain situation to just try to describe that phenomenon. These are the what, where, when types of questions. And these descriptive questions, descriptive research is super important because you do want to have an understanding of your research problem before you start asking why, why does this exist? Then we have the associative questions, which look for a relationship among variables or an association, but not necessarily causation. That would be the 3rd type of question. Obviously, it's the causal questions that investigate cause and effect. They kind of try to connect the dots by identifying the causal factors and the outcomes of whatever your target event, situation, phenomenon, behavior might be. So this causal research can be quite difficult. It can be difficult to fully explain exactly why things are happening. We need a lot of different types of data usually, and some pretty fair skills to be able to interpret that data and say, what does this all mean? But you guys, of course, are all capable of that, and different methods will lend themselves in different ways to that process of explaining why as well. So overall, the qualitative and quantitative methods or data have their strengths and weaknesses. And because of this, they're usually used for different types of questions or purposes. So the questions you have are related to things like feelings, complex behaviors, attitudes perhaps on some sensitive topics, or where you just want a lot of detailed information that's maybe nuanced or specific to that condition or behavior. Then you would use more qualitative methods, things like focus group, group discussions, in-depth interviews to really get at that nuance and get at the detail in that story. If the information you need requires more precise data that's standardized, that you can quantify, that you can draw statistical analyses from, then you're going to want to use more quantitative data and observation methods. So things like surveys, for example, or taking numerical observations are on that side of the spectrum. So which is best of those methods? It really ultimately depends on your research question, what kind of information you're looking for, because both have really great strengths, but of course, both have really great weaknesses too. So it's just about choosing the method whose strengths best support the question that you're asking to get the best type of data to answer the question. And so I guess to explain this image here, most of the time your study is going to rely heavily on one type of data, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. So let's say the white color here represents the quantitative data. Most of the time, even if you lean heavily on one type of data, you're also going to want to include the other type as well. So if you're using mostly qualitative, mix in a little bit of quantitative data as well. That just typically provides for a richer understanding of what's going on. And the quantitative methods are going to show you things that the qualitative can't, and vice versa. So this idea of mixing methods has a very obvious name. This is called the mixed methods approach, when you combine these different methods. So there are 3 ways to combine your methods, and they're pictured here on the screen. So one, you can converge your 2 data sets by bringing them together on the top. So you merge qualitative and quantitative to figure out your results. You can connect the data by having one set of data build on the other. For example, maybe I go do focus groups first, and then the information that I learn from the focus groups helps me come up with a survey to collect quantitative data, and both of those help me get to my results. And then finally, you can embed one data set within the other at the same time. So perhaps I do an open-ended interview, and then at the end, I also collect some quantitative data from my respondent. So basically, the key with mixed methods is that you don't want to just simply collect and analyze, some quantitative and some qualitative. They need to be mixed or combined in a way that really makes sense, that's methodical, that's really well thought out essentially, so that together they intentionally form a more complete picture of the problem so that they play off of each other or relate to each other somehow, these different data sets. There are, of course, some challenges involved with mixing your methods like this, as you might suspect. For one, obviously it's going to increase the complexity of your analysis and interpretation, evaluation of the data. And really your research design and process in general, because you don't have to come up with just one method, but an entire separate method, right? So this can just complicate the process. You have more strategies and plans to come up with, more methods to come up with, and then more data and different types of data to deal with. So if you're used to quantitative data, you might have to learn how to process qualitative data, or even bring on perhaps another researcher whose emphasis or expertise is in qualitative data. So this brings me to a second challenge, is just that it increases the resources required to complete your research when you're bringing in more mixed methods. For example, that extra researcher who has expertise or just the time to come up with the program and process it. But it's definitely worth it. I don't mean to turn you off. Those are just some challenges to be aware of. Okay, so we're going to review some different types of methods here. And for one, of course, you can choose to use these methods in your own research. But if you don't want to do that and you want to stick to just using surveys, that's totally fine. But also understanding these different types of methods and strategies and the different strengths and weaknesses of each is just helpful in general, so that when you encounter them, perhaps when you're doing a literature search or discussing with other researchers, you have a basic idea of the strengths and weaknesses of each, so you can make an assessment of the validity or the reliability of the data, or the conclusions, the results from that study that you're looking at. So we've split this up here. Of course, we have qualitative and quantitative data, which we just went over with, those just big idea, different types of data. And then we split this up into strategies. These are strategies that you can take for your entire research process. And then we also have different methods which can be used within each strategy. And I think I'm going to be honest with you here, is that drawing the line between strategies and methods sometimes can be difficult, and I have seen it, you may see that line be drawn differently by different people, or sometimes we just use the word methods really loosely. So, I mean, you've seen it already in this presentation. We have quantitative methods, we have data collection methods, we have sampling methods. That word gets used a lot. So I'm just, I want to tell you this so that when you encounter different terms being used maybe in different ways in the literature, that you understand why that's happening. So for example, here we describe survey research as a method, but you may very well see that described also as a general research strategy or research approach. The same thing can go for case study. Sometimes it's described as a strategy, other times it's described as a method. So just be aware of that. Basically though, methods are just ways of acquiring information, and the strategies are more like the research design that we employ to collect that information. So we employ this strategy, we use those methods within it. And then different strategies have different traditions within them. The point here really is that there are different ways to acquire information, and there are different strategies for doing so. And they all have their strengths, and they all have unique types of understanding that they can contribute to a phenomenon. So I like to imagine, for example, if my question is what motivates people to recycle, I could probably use all of these strategies and all of these methods at different times, and each would help me answer that question. Of course, each is going to offer a different type of data, a different type of insight to answer my question, but they could all still be used to get at some sort of understanding of why people recycle or what motivates them to recycle. So what we're going to do quickly is go through first the general strategies and then transition into the methods. And I know that some of these Dr. James has introduced to you already. So that's okay. If you feel comfortable with these, then you can skip by those examples as you see them. But of course, it's always just good to review and go into a little bit more depth. So we'll start off with our strategies with experimental research. So these are studies that are intended to test for cause and effect relationships, essentially hypotheses. And typically they're in fairly controlled settings that can separate the cause from the effect in time, and then also administer different treatments to one group and maybe have the other group as a control. So you can really get at, does this treatment have an effect, and if so, what is it? By comparing those two different groups, right? So we know that experiments can be conducted in a lab setting for sure. A lot of environmental communication setting or experiments are conducted in a lab setting where you might come in and they will introduce you to different types of environmental communication in an experiment to test what's the most effective message to inspire people to act for climate change. So that would be a lab, or you can do a natural setting where it's just happening in real life. You don't have to bring people anywhere to participate in the experiment. Of course, with experiments too, you want to do before and after your treatment, before and after on the group that receives the treatment, and before and after on the control group. This is pretty basic scientific method, one of them, right? So the strength then is that it pretty clearly can make a relationship between cause and effect to tell you if a treatment did have an effect. So that's really useful. That's a clear result. The weakness though is that at the same time, especially in natural settings, is that we can't control for all of the variables. So we can't always be totally sure, especially, like I said, in these natural settings where things are just happening in real life and there's all these other variables going around that we might not be accounting for in our study. Thirdly, I guess this is an interesting one, is that there are some ethical challenges related to experiments. So depending on your research design, for example, you might be deciding who gets placed into a treatment group and who gets placed into a control group. And depending on what your treatments are, there can be some ethical concerns of who ends up in each group. Of course, with experiments on medicine, that challenge is really clear. What if the people in the treatment group have a negative reaction to the medicine, but you put them in that treatment group? With social science, it could be a little bit more difficult to picture, but I'll give you an example. We did at the Living Desert an experimental study on basically restaurants closing their dumpsters. We wanted to see if our person-to-person conversations with them encourage them to close their dumpster more. And the reason we want them to close their dumpster is because it feeds ravens, and ravens are pests, and they feed on other native wildlife. So we had 60 restaurants, and we went and spoke directly with 30 of them. This was our treatment to say, please close your dumpsters. This is why it's important. The control restaurants did not get that conversation. And what happened was those treatment restaurants were presented with an opportunity to be inspired, to be better. And this is important because some of those restaurants did make a change. And what we did after our study is we found all the restaurants who were doing a good job keeping their dumpsters closed all the time. And we actually gave them awards that face the public. So the public can see who closes their dumpsters, who's a good community resident, and who doesn't close their dumpsters. And so here's the little ethical concern in there is, how do the control restaurants feel about the fact that they didn't receive that conversation or that treatment at all? So they might not have any reason to know that it's important, so important to close your dumpster. And because they didn't know that, they didn't have the same opportunity to improve their behavior and receive an award, if that makes sense. So we had the control of who received that treatment and who didn't. And we need to make sure that we're fair and that people don't feel like they missed out on an opportunity. Or it could be the opposite, that maybe the treatment group has a negative effect. Anyway, you need to think about those things and try your best to make up for that. So in our case, what we're doing is going back to those control restaurants who didn't receive the treatment, and we are giving them the opportunity still to try to change their behavior after the research was completed. Okay, moving on. Another strategy here is evaluation research. And this is a specific type of research that's used when there's a social intervention that's either planned or has already happened. And this research tests the impact of that intervention or the outcomes. And the evaluation sometimes can be done before the intervention in what's called a needs assessment. So there's certain traditions within evaluation research, and the topics are really limitless. You could be evaluating the effects of a policy change, evaluation of the educational program, of a new farming technique. It's really diverse here. In a lot of ways, there is similarity with the experimental group, because one method that people use to perform an evaluation is actually an experiment where one group receives an intervention and the other group does not receive an intervention, and they use evaluative methods to test the outcomes and the impacts between those two groups. But there are other ways to do evaluations too. Let's say I have a 4th grade class and I want to test how a unique environmental program changes their knowledge of giraffes. I can monitor their progress throughout that program to test the effects. And I can also do mixed methods. So I can use qualitative methods. I can ask them, how does this change your thoughts? Or how does this program make you feel? And get those rich, open-ended answers. I can also use a survey to collect their data. So the challenges here are, one, that sometimes it can be difficult to identify which outcome indicators you're going to be studying. sometimes you might not know what the outcomes will be of a certain social intervention in advance. So how do you know what to be testing for on the backside of it? Or another similar but different challenge is how exactly do you define success of an evaluation? Most of these evaluations are looking for success or failure. What can be improved? What can be changed? Was the intervention effective? What did it cause? And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we define success? Or how much change is enough change to say, yes, this is working, continue this program? And this is a challenge because a lot of times evaluations take place on programs, and the results may determine whether that program continues or not, especially things like educational programs, maybe teaching farmers how to change to different methods. So what happens if you do evaluation on a program and it comes out that there's only been a 3% change in attitudes? Is that enough? And so you want to be really careful about how you go about this, because what if it wasn't enough for the leaders of that program and then they decide to end it? So there's some different things to consider in here. Ultimately, your plan just needs to be designed carefully and as much as possible have your expected outcomes and criteria for success clear in the beginning before you start the research. But again, sometimes you don't know what changes are going to come until they do. I think another ethical challenge here is that sometimes your evaluation might go against what people believe or against what they expect or against what they want to hear. And then that can cause some difficult professional or personal relationships as you figure out how to deal with your conclusions that go against what they thought or what they believe is true. And then finally, because some evaluation research does use experiments, not all, but some, then we have the same challenges with experiments, that it can be difficult to control for all of our variables, for example. And then a lot of times it may take time for changes to make themselves apparent after an intervention. So evaluation research can sometimes extend for those long periods of time too, trying to track those changes. But the strengths here is that these evaluations are typically applied to a specific program or a specific situation, which makes it a very applied and useful research, very targeted, so you can come out with exact idea of what was working well, what wasn't working well, what can we change, and go out and do it. Another strategy here is the case study. So this is an in-depth study on one or a few individuals, groups, or situations, phenomena over time. And these case studies use mixed methods for sure. So a lot of qualitative, understanding what's going on here, and a lot of quantitative as well. It's a very detailed examination of one case, hence the word case study. So for example, I could do a case study on one community conservancy and figure out how are they, what's their operation strategy? How does this conservancy, this one case specifically, how do they communicate with local community members, for example? And I might collect this data through interviews with staff members. I might make personal observations during my time there. I'll probably be there for several weeks observing. I might review their documents. Basically as much data as I can get to help me understand this one case in a very detailed way. So that's their strength, right? Is that I have a very deep, expansive understanding of what's going on there. I've seen their documents, I've sat in on their meetings, observed them in the field. I've had interviews with them. Maybe I did surveys too. So I have a lot of information, which allows me to make a really clear interpretation of what's going on. However, there are some obvious weaknesses for this one. Because it is so site specific, you definitely cannot generalize your results to other areas because that rich understanding is specific to your case. So one way around this, or one way to increase the generalizability just a bit, is to do multiple case studies. So instead of deeply studying just one community conservancy, I could study 10 at the same level of detail, and then I might have a more clear understanding of, okay, so these are the 3 common factors that encourage effective communication with community members after I've done multiple cases. The other thing with this is that because you don't exactly have control or defined measurements, it can still be difficult to examine causality or cause and effect, if that makes sense. So you have a lot of data, you have to be really skilled to pick out the different points to say this causes this. It can be hard to be sure. Okay, and again, as we go through these different slides, if you have questions on any of them, or if there's something that's not clear or something that you would like to know more about, please do let us know through an email, a WhatsApp text, a Facebook message, a comment on the discussion board, any of those, and we can fill you in on some more information. So onto the methods. Survey research is an easy one for us because, of course, this entire course is designed around creating a survey. So we're familiar with this. It's a standardized questionnaire. It's used typically to study a population that's too large to observe directly. And it uses these questionnaires to do so. So we know that these are useful for our purposes, certainly for understanding attitudes, values, beliefs, knowledge, opinions, things like that. They're also useful in descriptive studies. Think about your census survey is essentially a descriptive study of describing what's going on, how many people, what's the gender, the age, basic description. So we have, of course, some weaknesses here. Because it is so standardized, the survey format, it only captures standardized results. So this is pretty surface level, and we're not going to be able to explain all the detail that led to that answer. Secondly, because surveys can only collect self-reported answers from respondents, they are limited in the truth that they capture. So whether that's because people don't remember correctly, or because they lie, or because they forgot, or they predict a behavior, but they predict it incorrectly. This just causes some challenges for the validity of those responses. So again, imagine if you asked someone, do you support this policy? And they never heard of the policy before. But you have standardized options that they have to give some sort of indication. Strengths. For one, it's in the nature that survey research can take large samples at a time. So this is helpful for getting those statistical analyses out of our data and making some clear linkages, especially in associative questions or causal questions. We can say more of this variable creates less of this variable. It's pretty clear to make those connections when you have such a large sample and standardized quantitative data to work with. Okay, I think we're familiar with that one. Okay, so I added this little guy in here, the action man, means to take action. As we go through these, so you're familiar with survey research, I didn't put one there, but as we go through the rest of these different methods, I think it would be helpful, I would encourage you to pause at the end of each slide and just as a creative exercise, come up with a way that you could use this research method to collect data that's relevant to your research question or data that could answer your research question. So in this course, we're creating surveys, but just kind of work your social science methods and come up with ways to use these other methods to answer the same sort of question. And I think by doing that, we can get a better understanding of how we can capitalize on or how we can benefit from the strengths and weaknesses of different methods to answer the same question. So we have semi-structured interviews. These are open-ended questions, so qualitative data, and interviews are used to explore topics in great depth. They're far less structured. So I ask you a question, I don't provide you with 5 answer choices. You have free space to tell me exactly what you think. And so semi-structured is just one type of interviewing. What semi-structured means is that I still have a list of questions. Let's say I have 10 questions on what we call an interview guide. So I'm still defining the topics that I want to talk about and what exactly I want to ask about. But it's only semi-structured. So what that means is that I can add other questions where I see necessary. Whether that's a totally new question or maybe I'm just saying, can you tell me more about what you just said? Or maybe they raise an interesting point and I ask them to narrow it down a bit and say, do you think that means that people in your community are not receptive to this program? So I can make up questions as I go. Of course, you're not making up questions the whole way. For the most part, you want to stick to your structure. So you get all the data that you want primarily, but it's okay to go this way for a bit and go that way for a bit. Then there's unstructured interviewing, which I think requires a certain skill set. There's basically no structure. Maybe I have one question that I come in to start with and I say, tell me what you think about conservation efforts by the government. And I let you start talking. And I don't have any other questions planned. I don't have any structure. I just follow that conversation where it goes. So I ask questions as they arise. I kind of follow the data and just see what comes out of that. I prefer the semi-structured because you have some sort of plan. You can make sure you're getting the data that you want to, but unstructured has its purpose too. It could be a useful technique, even if you don't want to do a whole research method, but just to use that approach in your design phase when you're talking to stakeholders or people in the community trying to get ideas. So tell me what you think about the wildebeest migration and just see where that conversation takes you. And from that, you can get ideas of what would be important to include in a survey, for example. So basically though, I still have topics that I want to talk about, but I'm not the one who's doing most of the talking. Typically in an interview, the respondent should be doing about 95% of the talking, and I, as the interviewer, do about 5%. So I'm mostly just listening. And during these interviews, you'll want to record what they're saying typically, so you can go back later and look at all of that really rich data, those texts, the stories that they told. So here's the strengths that we can when we do get that rich data, those stories, we can uncover nuances and details and have a deep understanding of all the things, for example, that are leading to one decision. And then, of course, there's flexibility in the questions that you ask when it's semi-structured. You can choose to go into more depth or ask for more information. It's not so structured as those questionnaires. The weaknesses then is because it's not as structured, it's not standardized, it's much harder. You really can't make some statistical descriptions about your conclusions. You can't really generalize to a larger population because of that. And then secondly, it's resource intensive. So it takes time to sit down and have those conversations with people. It can be a long process. Whereas a questionnaire you can hand to somebody and they can complete quickly, or they can return it to you at a later time. Whereas in interview, you have to sit down and have a long conversation. And sometimes it can be quite exhausting to sit and listen. You have to listen so actively. So it takes a lot of time and energy to do this type, to use this method. But it has its uses. Okay, so participatory action research is quite a unique method. I think it's currently gaining some popularity, and this is when researchers collaborate with their respondents or with their participants to deeply understand a situation and how to change it. So it's really a group activity. The researcher will lead the efforts and have some certain expertise, but the community members are participating equally too. They're doing activities, discussions, and most of the time this is context specific and it'll be targeted to the needs of a certain group. What challenge do you have? Let's sit down and let's work on it. And it's a huge cycle of research. So there's that action, there's the research step, there's action. It usually takes place over time. You might come back, researcher and community members, and reflect on what's happened. Maybe do some more activities. And the purpose of this type of research is to free or liberate the participants themselves to have a much greater awareness of their situation so that they themselves can take action. So it's not just, I come into your community, I take your data, I interpret it, I make recommendations, and I give them back. But everyone comes together and we look at the information together and we decide right there what needs to happen based on this information to create positive change. And here, again, you can use different methods, qualitative, quantitative, activities. It's quite diverse. And the strength here is that it really does produce actionable knowledge, as you can imagine. And because of that, and because of the fact that you're involving people so deeply, there's a greater chance that your recommendations or the ideas that come out will be implemented and that change will happen. The weakness then is that it is resource intensive for you as the researcher, but also for the community members that take part in this. So you want to make sure that your community members are on board and they're dedicated. And this is usually the case because these problems will come up from the community themselves. So they're already interested in solving it, but they might not know how much time it will take to get to the root of it and to come up with some actions, implement them, reflect upon them, and so on. So a lot of time and money and resources in general. And then also, in a way, it requires some specialist skills because your role as a researcher no longer is to give a survey and take the data and analyze it separately, but now you have all these other responsibilities of leading discussions, or facilitating relationships. You're the facilitator, leader of this entire huge process, so you have a lot more responsibilities. And typically those are things that you would want to have some sort of an expertise in or confidence in. That's an extra ability that you would have. So this is a really, I think, neat type of research. It would be interesting to undertake again. See if you can pause here and come up with a way, even if it's just in your imagination, that you could use this method to answer your questions. And it doesn't have to be community members. It could be, I default to that action, but it could be staff members in an organization as well. As an example, just a group of people that have a common challenge that they want to solve. Okay, so on to focus groups. This is kind of like interviews, except in a group. So it's a guided discussion with a small group, and it's pretty much a qualitative data collection. So small group, that's typically about 6 to 10 people. You bring them together in one location and you have them discuss a phenomenon, situation, event that's of interest to you in your research question. So it could be unstructured. You could come in and start with one question, see where the conversation takes you. Typically, though, you want to have it semi-structured where you still have some questions, some topics that you want to specifically address within that conversation. So in your group of 6 to 10 people, you'll want to have, it depends. You could have a focus group of all different ranchers who are trying to identify common challenges or common perceptions of ranchers. Or you could have a mixed focus group with different stakeholders of a rancher, a mother of 4 kids, a retired teacher, a businessman, all come together as representatives of the community to talk about water conservation. So you can have very focused focus groups or diverse focus groups, but either way, you're going to be involved in this deep discussion that allows you to understand the ideas and perceptions coming from each of those members and how they relate to each other or how they conflict with each other. And through this understanding, you'll be able to better understand the problem based on their experiences. And the neat thing about the focus group is it's not just you one-on-one with a person, but there are other voices in the room and they will interact with each other. And that creates a whole different type of data. And typically these focus groups, they will last for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. They can be pretty intense. So make sure people are aware of that before they agree to participate. So yes, the strengths here is that it is open-ended, it is a rich exploration. You have a lot of minds working together that are bringing up new topics and new information that you might not have even thought to ask about. The weakness is that, again, it's a small sample size, and this can be a challenge with a lot of qualitative research. I don't have time to interview 400 people to get a good sample size. So because of that, you can't really generalize it, and because it's qualitative data, you also can't necessarily quantify it. You can have some quantitative data for sure, but for the most part, it's qualitative data in these focus groups. And then same with the participatory action research is that this requires an extra sort of skill of how do you lead and facilitate that conversation, especially when sometimes you have conflict come up between different members of the group, especially when you have those multi-stakeholder focus groups where they can have very different perspectives. So you have to be prepared. You have to know how to handle that situation. And then I think there's maybe a challenge of you're asking a lot of people, so you have to make sure that they're comfortable, bring drinks and food, water, make them feel good about it. Okay, content analysis is just the study of recorded communication. So that could be books, articles, policies, ads in magazines, it could be drawings, it could even be songs. And you can analyze these in different ways. So for example, you can examine for the presence of certain words or themes or concepts that are prevalent. You can measure for the meanings or relationships above them. You could think of this in one way, like it's a bit of it could be a qualitative analysis if you're reading texts from a bunch of different books and you're trying to decipher from that rich story-like data, what are the major themes here? How do they relate to each other? It could also be quantitative if you're counting the number of times that certain words appear across different sources of recorded communication. It's just that the data's already there. You're not going out and collecting it from people. So because of that, you do save some time and money. You don't have to go out into the field to engage with the people. You just collect your sources, your content, and analyze from there. That also means that you're flexible. You know, you can work whenever, you can work at midnight, you can work by yourself. And then the strength here is that even though a lot of it can be qualitative data, that you can also quantify your data, especially if you have a large enough sample size of different content to do so. On the flip side, if you don't have enough content available, then you can have a very limited source and it can make it hard to analyze that data at all. And because of that, sometimes it's not quantifiable. So for an example, let's say you hypothesize that tourism companies who use green words in their advertising materials, things like sustainable or eco, you hypothesize that they receive higher ratings of satisfaction from their guests. So you could do a content analysis on these materials. You would need to determine still what materials, over what time period are you investigating, how many materials will you analyze, what qualifies as a green word, and then you could go through, count the green words used in the different advertisements, compare it against the ratings of that company and see if there's a relationship there. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, passive observation. I know Dr. James went over this one as well earlier in the course. So it's just what it sounds like. You're observing people unobtrusively to collect data. So you don't approach them, you don't ask them to do a survey, you don't ask them to do anything, you just observe from a distance their behavior. And this can be really useful because one, there's when you collect this data, you don't have to rely on the self-reports of your participants. So like we talked about earlier, your participants might not remember exactly what they did and they might report falsely because of that on their behavior, or maybe they predict their behavior incorrectly. Whereas with observation, you can see exactly what's happening. So you skip that middleman in a way. And related to that, you will be able to sometimes see things that your participant won't be able to see. So there's information about the environment or the behavior that the observer can recognize and record, but the participant might be totally oblivious to it. So if you were to ask them to describe features of the environment that encourage them to act a certain way, they might not be able to, because they might not have even been aware of what was going on. But as an observer, you can see it. And because of this, passive observation as a method is really complementary to other types of data. So you could, for example, collect information from those people about their behavior, and then go back again and observe their behavior, and use those together to understand really what's going on here. And then there's some weakness here. Depending on how you're observing, just the presence of you being there could influence their behavior. On the other hand, maybe you want to make observations, but you can't access those people while they're doing those behaviors to even see what's happening. If you want to know about what behaviors take place in the home or deep in the agricultural fields, you might not be able to go out and observe. So there's some limitations. Also, your interpretation can be subject to bias. So because I'm not asking people to describe or to tell me their own responses, I rely solely on my own interpretation of what's going on, and it could be wrong. So that's just one thing to consider. It's also time consuming to sit and observe for extended periods of time. And of course, it doesn't necessarily answer the why. You can describe what's happening and make hypotheses, but you don't have the data to explain why that's happening. Okay, and this one I know Dr. James went over as well. So using media or art to collect data is a really interesting one. Interesting method. So in this case, art is actively applied by participants as a process to study social or behavioral phenomena. So for example, you can ask participants to draw how they feel about something, or draw the important aspects of their community. You could ask them, I've seen a study that asked people to draw a map of the local natural areas that were important to them. There's another good example that I really like. A researcher wanted to know how a certain community living in, I think, a mountain village of India, he wanted to know how they perceived or how they defined, how they envisioned nature. So that might be a hard question to answer. If you asked me, how do you define nature? It would be really difficult, I think, to explain that to somebody in words. So what he did is he got dozens of disposable cameras, and he passed them out to research participants. And he said, go take pictures of nature. And they came back with their pictures, and he was able to then look at them and sort them out and have a much greater understanding of, this is what people think of when they think of nature. I think surprisingly in that case, there were a lot of photos of people. So that's an interesting finding, that that's how they envision nature, was the people living in their community, and other ways too. And I think if you wanted to add a layer to that, you could, which he might have done, you could hand cameras to different demographics, different genders maybe, different professions, and see how they define nature. So this can be a really creative tool. It would have to be really applicable to your method. I could imagine some questions that would be hard to employ art for sure, but see if you can do it for your research question. So the strength here is, like we saw in that example with the photos of nature, there is a potential for really rich qualitative data, meaningful descriptive data. The weakness, same with the observation, is that there's potential for error in interpretation. I see those pictures and that's all I have to go, that's all I have to make my decisions or my interpretation of what I'm looking at here. And I may write down, this picture means this, but it means that to me. And so I'm kind of making an assumption of what it means to that other person. So there's some potential for decreased accuracy here. And sometimes this is a super creative method, and it can definitely be super useful. But depending on how it's used, it might not be very well received. So in general, some of the physical scientists in that field already have a hard time accepting social data, sometimes social science data. And so imagine what they would think if you said, I analyzed 100 drawings and I conclude that there might just be some questions about, is that really reliable? It's just not yet a very widely accepted form of science, but it's definitely good. It has its place for sure. So these I'm going to go over very quickly because I know Dr. James already mentioned them. So some other methods, I think, or they could be used as tools within methods. So this one, this personal meaning map analysis, it's essentially an interactive way to collect qualitative data rather than asking people to tell you what they think about fishing for sharks. You give them something like this and they can interact with it in a different way to produce some responses. And the design of it might tell you something as well. This, for example, is a tool I think that you could use within participatory action research. You could have your participants do something like this in groups, individually, on a board, etc. This is another one that Dr. James mentioned. So card sorts. And as he said, this could be a good tool for people who might not read very well, whether that's people who don't read very well or children who haven't learned to read yet. You can sort your cards into categories or rank your items to demonstrate your perceptions or your attitudes or things you like and things you don't like. And there's a lot of ways to use this one as well. So I'm going to give you another example just to help you conceptualize different ways to use these different methods. I participated in someone else's research one time that was a type of card sort, not with pictures, but with words. So in the United States, we have what are called wild and scenic rivers. They're designated as that by the government. And to be a wild and scenic river, you have to meet certain criteria. And those rivers have to be managed for certain purposes. So to name a few of those would be solitude, reserves for native plants, I think I'm forgetting them, recreation. So there's different things, different standards that need to be met by the managers of those rivers. So this research was trying to figure out which of those criteria are most important to the users of these rivers, so that we could give that data to the managers and say, this is what the users are finding most important. The problem behind this is that more and more people are using rivers, and it's getting harder and harder to meet all of those management standards. For example, solitude. If you have thousands and thousands of people using one wild and scenic river, it might be hard to find solitude. But basically, what happened is, as a participant, I was given 27 cards, and each of those cards had one of the management criteria written onto it. And I was asked to sort them in a sort of pyramid that indicated which were most important to me, which were not important. And the researcher recorded my sorting, and of course the sortings of many other people, so that that data was given to the managers, to say this is what is important. And again, I don't know all the details of that study, but I'm sure that the researcher had different types of people filling out or completing the activity. So we probably had local people living near the river, people like me who live 3 hours away and only visit at certain times. So you can see, how do we manage this river? But so you get the example, right? That you sort things as a sort of interactive activity to give some sort of an insight, which would be much more difficult if he gave me a survey with all the 27 criteria listed and asked me to rank them on that piece of paper. So it was much easier to move them around on the table and rearrange, things like that. Okay, so back to this question of which method is best. And again, it all comes back to your research question and your purpose. And this general suggestion that for the most part you should try to mix your methods to get some qualitative and some quantitative data. So a really simple way to do that for surveys, for example, is to first hold a focus group where you get your respondents together and you start talking about some important concerns or just general topics, and based on the qualitative information that you collect there, you can use that to create a really well-informed survey to collect quantitative data. Again, just mixing your methods, right, in a really thoughtful way to get a more holistic idea of what's going on. Yes, so here, again, if you want to pause, considering the methods that we just reviewed, some of the examples, the tools, and the general strategies, I would recommend to take just a few minutes to try to come up with what are different ways that you could mix methods for your research question. And now we're going to get into exactly how do we select these methods. So what are some steps to take along the way? And at each of those steps, I'm just going to mention some questions that you want to be asking yourself. So we always come back to this. Your purpose really dictates so much in the research design. So first you want to determine your purpose. What do you want to learn? Why do you want to learn it? What outcomes do you expect? What questions exactly are leading your data collection? What type of question? What concepts are you studying? And then what type of information do you need, you want to answer these questions? And then importantly, who is your audience? So it's important to know who's going to get your results. We want, maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else, but we want these results to be actionable. So who's your audience? How do they intend to use the data? Again, it's important to include these people in the conversation from the very beginning. You could ask them, you could say, I'm researching blank to find out blank, and I'm interested in this because blank. Would this data be useful to you? Or are there related questions that you're interested in that I can try to address? Or maybe that research is not even your idea, but they're coming to you asking you to do it. But and still you would want to ask, well, what type of analysis would be most useful to you? Do you want stories? Do you want rich data? Or do you want some quantifiable survey data? So have those conversations. Secondly, we want to determine who can provide the information. And this can really determine which methods are going to be best. So who's going to participate? How can you access these people? Or in other words, what's the best way to access them? And then what methods might they prefer to interact with? We saw a very clear example with the card sorts. If they can't read, then you're going to have to use a very specific method. Or maybe they might not want to sit down for an hour and a half interview. It depends. So what's the best way to interact with these people? And then also, who might they prefer to interact with? So this is important to consider. The relationship with the researcher and the respondents can be really influential to the quality of the data that's collected, or if they even want to interact with you at all. So for example, this is a really easy example that sometimes in some cultures, women would not really be comfortable sharing their sensitive information or information at all with the man. Maybe they wouldn't be comfortable sitting down for an hour to do an hour-long interview with you. So these are things that you need to consider. And then you might change your method based on that. So maybe you decide to drop off a survey instead, so they don't have to sit with you, if you're a man, for an hour. Or maybe you're a woman researcher and you don't want to sit down with a man for an hour. So there are some ways around that to change your methods or to change your data collection technique. So maybe it's just as easy if you're a female researcher to bring a coworker with you to do the interview. So think about these things when you're coming up with your methods, not when you're knocking on someone's door and you realize that maybe this isn't the best match. Some other questions: what language or what terms will be appropriate? They might not be familiar with the terms that you're using. So how do you break this down? How do you employ a method that can get around maybe some complicated terms and make it easier for people to understand what you're asking them to give the appropriate data? And also consider what barriers people might encounter when they're trying to interact with your data collection method, so you can remove those barriers, or you can find ways to navigate them to make your method the best. Or choose a different method that doesn't have such negative barriers. Step 3, you want to select a strategy. So those were the things like experiments, or maybe you're doing an evaluation. Because these strategies have different traditions associated with them, picking that from the beginning will help you pick appropriate methods following that. You can do this by looking at previous research, seeking other opinions from colleagues or experts, and then also just refer back to your question and what makes the most sense? What strategy makes the most sense? Do you have time to do a case study? Do you want generalizable results? Has there been an intervention? Things like that. Or maybe you just want to do a survey and it doesn't need to fall into a case study. It's just going to be survey research. In either way, you want to review your options and see what's going to work best for your purpose. And then finally, you can select your methods within your strategy. So here again, you want to look to previous research, what has been done, what worked well, what didn't work well. And then again, find some useful ways to combine different methods, different qualitative and quantitative data. And I think really take your time on this and consider the strengths and weaknesses of each method and how those strengths and weaknesses are going to relate to the purpose of your research, relate to the expected outcomes, and how they will relate to your ability to collect the data that you need for those two things. So kind of go through, like a thought exercise, go through them all and just see what's going to work well for you. Once you have that sorted out, you want to think about the details. So the small details of your methods or the data collection techniques are just as important as the big picture. So you've decided on an experiment and you're going to use surveys to collect data, but at this point, do you want to mail the survey or do you want to email it? Do you want to complete the survey in person with you speaking to the participant? So work out these little fine details far ahead of time. And they're all going to have their strengths and weaknesses too. Depends on your purpose of which is going to be acceptable. And then finally, step 4, we're almost done here. Ask yourself, do you have the resources or the ability to collect the data using these methods? So we saw a spectrum of methods that were resource intensive or low on resources. And how does that fit with your ability? Do you have the time? Do you have the funding? There's 4 main categories here. Funding, just for training or for transportation, for paying other staff members. Do you have the, what we would call human resources? So do you have the skills appropriate? Whether that's a language or the ability to facilitate a conversation. Do you have that skill? Also, logistical capacity. Do you have the ability to coordinate the type of method you're using? If you're sending out, you want to send out 10 people to do surveys in different areas around town, do you have the capacity to do that? And then finally, time as a resource. So that's simple. Do you have the time to collect this data in the way that you want to? And do you have the time to analyze the data that's going to come out of it? So that's especially important for qualitative data, right? Where you have a lot of information to be working with on the other side. All those interviews, all the text recorded. So just some things to consider at this point. And if you find that maybe you don't have the resources, then that's fine. And go back and figure out ways to tweak or change your method, or maybe just choose a different method. And then you want to come up with your data collection protocol. So this is just the plans, procedures, the standards for how you're going to collect data. And we'll go over this in much more detail at a later time. So things like what hours of the day do we want to do surveys, or what will we do with our data immediately after it's collected? Just basic plans. And I slipped this in here because we know that sampling methods are really tied closely to your data collection methods. So kind of want to ask the same questions to figure out your sampling purpose or your sampling method. What's your research purpose? What's your data collection method? And what's your capacity to get that sort of sample? And sampling too is something that we'll go into much more detail later, the different types of sampling methods and the strengths and weaknesses of each of those. Okay. Finally, once you've completed those steps of selecting your research method, this step is often overlooked, but it's super important. You want to test your method before you commit to it, before you bring it out into the field and realize that it's not working as you wanted it to. So ideally, you would test this on a small group of your desired research participants that you would be sampling to see how they interact with the method, to see if you're collecting the data that you really wanted to, You can even ask them directly for feedback. What did you think of this? What needs to be changed? If you can't do that, sometimes you can't, then at least try to test your method on colleagues. Just one, to get used to it, to get used to handling the surveys, to get used to asking the questions, but also again to use them to help you come up with what could be improved here. Is the wording clear? My understanding, is this the best way? Things like that. So have those conversations. And again, last note here is based on that, most of your changes are going to be small, but always be prepared to make some big changes too. Be better to change something and take extra time improving it or editing your method rather than getting through the entire data collection process and realizing that you wish you had done it totally differently and you didn't get what you wanted, right? Okay, so that is all for session 4. Again, if you have questions, please let us know. Also, please spend some time playing around with these different methods, coming up with unique ways to use them to answer your research question or just to answer research questions in general so you can get comfortable with how they might be employed in the field. And when we come back for session 5, we'll be focusing on crafting a survey. And Dr. James is going to take that over for you guys, so you will see him again. In the meantime, please, please, please log on to the Facebook account and you can add your comments, your questions. You can reply to our discussion questions. You can make your own. That is really just to be a space where we can learn with each other and process the material and start exercising our muscles to come up with these social science methods, ideas, questions, things like that. So I encourage you to do that. And I will see you soon. At least talk to you soon. So thank you. Bye.